The series of lessons that we have is living soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. The language is taken directly from the text of Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. In that particular text, we are told that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, instructing us to the intent that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. And so I titled the series of sermons, Living Soberly, Righteously, and Godly in this Present World. Last week we discussed, for just a few moments, our language, the speech, and how we should speak pure speech, not ungodly speaking at all. This morning, as you can see from the screen, we are looking at gambling, what I call a parasite on public morals, gambling. In 1999, the United States Justice Department authorized a study on gambling. It was called the study on the impact study on gambling. And the impact study, this is 1999, this is 25 years ago, concluded the following. They said that gambling at one point in America was only in a few places here and there scattered throughout the country. But within the last 25 years, that would take it back to the 1970s, it has grown exponentially in America. There have become parimutuel betting tracks. There are gambling houses. Las Vegas is spread all over the United States. And so it recommended that we pause gambling, pause the growth of gambling, that we might study the impact of it upon humanity and upon the American people. Of course, that pause never really occurred. But now, here we are in 2025, and gambling has become commonplace in America. In 48 states out of the 50, there are gambling practices when we have, of course, the lottery. We have Indian casinos just right across the river here. And people by the droves go to these casinos. I made the comment one time driving up to Ranelette, and using the word church advisedly here, I said, you know, the biggest church in town is the casino on Sunday morning. The biggest assembly of people is the casino. Unfortunately, that's the case. And unfortunately, it is also the case that many Christians do not know or are not acquainted with the principles of the Bible that tell us that gambling is wrong and sinful and why we should avoid it. And it has become so commonplace, and so many preachers refuse or are not acquainted with the principles to preach on it. Consequently, we have come to a place of ignorance in our country regarding the practice of gambling. I call back your mind to that study, the impact study that the United States Justice Department did, 1999. It said, we need to pause the growth of gambling in order that we might learn the impact of that more directly on American people. We want to study what the impact is. That pause, of course, as I mentioned, never came. And now, of course, gambling is a part of the American way of life. So a couple of things by way of introduction that I would like to mention. Number one, the history of gambling. Gambling, of course, has been in the world ever since humanity has been in the world. That would be the sixth day of creation, practically speaking, almost. Gambling has been in all the countries of the world in all climes and all times. For example, you have, and this is a picture of ancient Pompeii that was destroyed in 79 AD. This is a picture that was found on one of the walls, and gambling was widely practiced in Pompeii. Anita and I were able a year and a half ago to go to Pompeii and see. These have been excavated and shown. And so we have gambling tables with the picture on the left of the screen of the die, one of the dies they have found there. Dicing was practiced widely in Pompeii in the Roman world. In the 4th century, a Roman by the name of Marcellinus Ammianus, close, isn't it? Marcellinus Ammianus said, you know, gambling is so widespread in the Roman Empire, but the upper crust of society disdains it, and they refer to the lower classes of society as dicers because they considered it to be a bane, a vice in society. You might think also of this passage in Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 11. Isaiah offers a blistering rebuke to people who would be in Babylonia. Now he's writing pre Babylonian captivity period, but he's talking about the Jews who are in captivity later in Babylonia. And he tells us about those Jews in 65 and verse 11. He says that they forget Jehovah and they have forgotten the holy mountain of God, and instead they make a table to fortune. That's with a capital F, fortune. And they mix a drink to destiny. Fortune and destiny were gods of chance, gods of gambling, so to speak. So Isaiah offers that blistering rebuke to those people who had forgotten my holy mountain in the vice of gambling. So also it takes place today. Now I want to make one word here regarding the casting of lots. Many people, when we speak about gambling, will ask the question regarding lot casting in the Old Testament as well as the New. As we know, in the Bible, they cast lots in order to make determination as to God's will. And there's the key to it. Lot casting, for example, the Jews to determine in the book of Joshua which tribe would occupy what portion of the land, they cast lots for it, but that was to determine the will of God. So also we find lots were cast as to determine which course of priests would serve at the temple. That's the book of Numbers. And then, of course, you might remember, even at the cross of Christ, there were those who gambled for the clothes of Christ. That was different than casting lots. Casting lots simply was a way to make known the will of God. Acts chapter 1, verse 26. Acts 1 and 26 was that they cast lots to make a determination as to God's will as to who would replace Judas, and that man was Matthias. So all of that to say simply that casting lots in the Old Testament or in the New had nothing to do with gambling per se at all. So let's think about this lesson. As far as this is concerned, we're going to look at, number one, the definition. What is the definition of gambling? Number two, we'll notice the motives for gambling. Number two, the motives. This is interesting. We'll come to an authority on the motives of gambling. And number three, the Bible teaches that gambling is sinful. And how is that the case? Where do we find that to be the case in the Bible? So let's look at, first of all, the definition of gambling. Gambling defined. Now, many times people say such things as, well, gambling is simply taking a risk. All farmers take a risk. If you're in the Air Force or in the military, you take a risk because you may lose your life defending our country. Taking a risk is not technically gambling in the sense that we're speaking about it here. So let's notice, as a matter of fact, I might mention this. The United States Post Office disallows gambling through its services. They're not, of course, telling us that there's not a risk involved in sending your mail through the post office. The United States Air Force also forbids gambling on its premises. But they're not saying that there's not a risk involved in defending your country. Taking a risk is not gambling, technically speaking. So here is the United States Post Office definition of gambling. What they forbid as through the mail or on its premises, the participating in games for money or other personal property, the operation of gambling devices, the conduct of a lottery or a pool, or the selling or purchasing of lottery tickets. United States Postal Service, they disallow it, and there's their definition. Gambling devices participating in games for money or other personal property, inclusive of the lottery. But here I like this definition. This is a man who studied it, has some material on it. His name is David McKenna. Listen to what he has to say regarding the definition of gambling. The willingness to take a risk motivated by a twisted desire to get something for nothing. It is parasitic, producing no personal growth. And you can see where I got the title for the lesson, A Parasite on Public Morals. Desire to get something for nothing. And it is parasitic, it produces no personal growth. I want to come back to that desire to get something for nothing. Keep that in your mind for just a few moments. This next definition comes from Thomas Eves, who was a director of a school of preaching in the Lord's Church in East Tennessee. and he had a lot of study on gambling, and here's the definition he gave of it, and I think this is probably the best succinct definition of gambling that there is. Desiring the possessions of another. The gambler creates a risk. That risk is losing his or her own possessions in an attempt to gain the possessions of another with nothing given in exchange. All right, think about that for just a moment. Desiring the possessions of another, the gambler creates a risk, that is, losing his own possessions, that's his risk, in an attempt to through which to gain the possessions of another without giving anything in exchange. That is really the real definition of gambling. Desiring the possessions of another, creating a risk in which you can gain the possessions of another and nothing given in exchange. Now, I put a note on the bottom of the screen to point out this. This shows us that gambling is wrong. We'll see more about that in a moment, because it is wrong in kind and not degree. Now, what do I mean by that? Many people ask the question, well, what about gambling for a quarter, gambling for 50 cents, gambling for $1? It is the principle that is wrong. It does not become wrong at a certain level of that which is risked. We cannot come to it and say, well, it's right at this level, but it's wrong at that level. The principle is wrong in and of itself. And so it is a matter of kind. It's not a matter of degree, how much you're risking, that makes it wrong. We'll think about more of that in just a moment. Before we get to that, let's notice a gambling motive or motivation for gambling. I have three things here, all of them coming out of the Hastings Dictionary of Religious Knowledge. And it gives us three basic motivations that people rely upon in order to gamble. Number one, the desire for gain. Number two, the desire for excitement. And number three, the desire for combativeness. Let's think about each of these in order for just a moment. The desire for gain is not simply, and that's putting it pretty simply, but the desire for gain is not simply gain per se, but it is gain circumventing how God said that we are to gain. The passage that was read in our hearing a few moments ago by Brother Bruce, Genesis chapter 3 and verses 17 through 19. Man is to gain by the sweat of his brow. But this is a desire to gain and circumventing that method that God has established for the rule for mankind. To circumvent, to go around laboring and toiling and sweating for my gain. That's what gambling involves, a desire for gain that way. So let's think about that more extendedly just a moment. This is exactly the same thing wrong with socialism. Socialism participates in the same error, in the same sin. It is a desire to gain at the expense of others without me putting my labor and toil into it. That's what it is. So I will empower a government to take from my neighbor to give to me. Or if I'm the person who's running for office and I promise that I'm going to give everybody on this side of the room money, I'm not going to give my money. I'm going to take from you and give to you. I have just gained this many voters right here by saying that. That's what socialism is. It is the same error. John Winthrop, Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of the first governors of that colony. They had a grain bin in which all the people put their produce of the field, whether it be corn or wheat, and they put them in the common bin, or the bins. And when people needed something, they had officers who would distribute the grain to those individuals. What do you think happened? They almost starved to death, because when everyone contributes and then everyone takes off, then people begin, it has a deleterious effect. That is a corrosive effect over a period of time. The labor and toil began to deplete among the people. And John Winthrop said, well, what's happening is a person is willing to take his time off from work, stay home from work, not go into the field, because after all, he can go to the common bin and get what he needs. And it had a deleterious effect upon the work ethic of individuals in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The same thing exactly happened in Jamestown, 1607. John Smith came over there. John Smith was a man's man. He had been captured by the Muslims, had survived the capture. A remarkable man, just a young man. He came over, he said, "You're doing it all wrong because they're practicing socialism." He said, "You have to have everybody responsible for their own field, their own part. And if a man doesn't work, neither let him eat." That's New Testament, 2 Thessalonians 3 and 10. John Winthrop did the same thing. So they experimented with socialism in Massachusetts Bay Colony and also in Jamestown, and they said, this will not ever work. Sadly, our country forgets the lessons of the past and tries it again. And that's what we've been doing in the 20th century, now in the 21st. Be that as it may, what's the problem there? The same thing that Sweden found out. They implemented socialism in the FDR period because it was a worldwide phenomenon. But the 1970s and 80s, they said, whoa, wait a minute, this is not working. We must reinstitute private sector jobs, and we must reinstitute the work ethic somehow and make people responsible for what they themselves produce. And so they went to free market solutions. The same thing exactly is the case regarding gambling as we find in socialism. It is an effort to gain without going by means of the sweat of our brow, without the labor and toil that God has established for man to gain his living. Number two, it is a desire for excitement. There is a sad phenomenon occurring among Americans and many American Christians, and that is we are so busy, all of our lives are running and gunning, and when we're not busy, we have the phone dinging, we have the television on, we have the radio on, we're listening to people talk, no quiet time, no thoughtful, reflective time at all. We don't think about the issues of life because we're so busy with everything, and that creates in us a desire for this excitement. And gambling has this desire for excitement, and it is let out in a gambling casino. That's what happens. It is important for Christian people to be still and know that I am God, and not to be so addicted to excitement. By the way, real Bible study is an exciting venture if we will spend our time studying the Bible alone, quietly. So the desire for excitement, the Hastings Dictionary of the Bible, or Dictionary of Ethics and Morals, tells us is one of the reasons that people gamble. Another one, number three, is desire for combativeness. Combativeness, not competition, not competing, because competition is good, but combativeness, take from some. Combativeness. And so those desires drive the gambling desires in America. So having said all of that, let's turn attention to why gambling is sinful. Now, saying that, people immediately ask me the kind of questions such as this. Where does the Bible say gambling is wrong? The problem with that is that we are not approaching the Bible from a biblical perspective on how to judge morals and moral character. We're not approaching human problems from a biblical perspective. I had a professor at Oklahoma Christian College. He would say, where does the Bible say you should not burn your neighbor's house down? Well, there's no passage that forbids you from burning his house down or her house down. But it is inconsistent with the principles that are outlined in the Bible. So exactly it is. If we had to have a book that told us all the do's and don'ts and every possibility that was known to man, you would not be able to carry the book. The Bible is filled with principles that we are to apply, and God has given us wisdom to do so. Gambling violates the principles of the Bible on several fronts, and let's notice those principles now. Number one, it violates the principle of honest work for our goods. the text that we just read in Genesis chapter 3, that man is to labor and toil for his bread, that is, for his living. According to Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 24, we have that there's nothing better for a man that he labor and toil and enjoy the fruit of his labor. Not the fruit of my neighbor's labor, not the fruit of your labor, the fruit of my labor. God has ordained that I work for my living. And if any man does not work, neither let him eat. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10. There's a passage that can be explored more at length. So number one, it violates the principle of honest work for our goods. No one can gamble and say that they're actually working or laboring when they're taking the goods actually of someone else. And that brings us to number two. Gambling is a form of covetousness. Interestingly, St. Francis de Sales was a Catholic priest in the 1950s. Reputedly, he had heard more confessions than any other Catholic priest. That would be a lot of confessions, St. Francis de Sales. He said, I heard more confessions than any other Catholic priest, but I have never heard someone confess that I have coveted. Why? He suggested, and I think he's right, not because people don't covet, but because we don't really recognize it, we don't understand it, we don't recognize it for what it is. That's why. We have, for example, in Joshua chapter 6, Achan saw the gold, the wedge of gold, and the garments of one of those persons of Jericho. He desired them, that is, coveted them, and he stole them and put them in his own tent. Stealing was after his desire. He coveted first. David saw Bathsheba, wanted her, coveted his neighbor's wife, and then he committed adultery with her. Coveting came first. So also Ahab wanted the field of Naboth. He offered him money for it. Naboth said no. He coveted it so much so. And what a sad story is this. He went to his room, he laid on his bed, faced the wall, and pouted. The king of Israel pouting. But he had a wife who was really the neck of that head. She said, I'll take care of it for you, Jezebel. And so she, of course, had it arranged where Naboth was murdered on false testimony. And so he took the field of Naboth. He coveted first, and he took later. Is it possible for a gambler to sit at a table or participate in a lottery, taking the possessions of another person, desiring that which they have, and still be a faithful Christian? I don't think so. That is actually a form of covetousness. That's what it is. It's a form of covetousness, desiring that which belongs to another person. And because it is legal does not make it right with God. Number three, gambling is a manifestation of the iron rule. What is the iron rule? The iron rule is the lowest of the three rules by which human behavior can be judged. There is, number one, the golden rule. Number two, the silver rule. Number three, the iron rule. The iron rule is might makes right. I'm stronger, I'll get it. I'm luckier than you, I'll take it. The silver rule is, as announced by the Jews, they would say, don't do unto others as you don't want them to do to you. That's a prohibition. That's the silver rule. But that's not what our Lord announced, is it, in Matthew 7 and 12? All things, therefore, you would that men should do to you, do you also unto them likewise. That's the golden rule. Can one successfully, faithfully follow the golden rule while desiring and coveting the goods of another and taking the goods of another person? Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 24, he says that my obligation as a Christian is to look out for the needs of my fellow, that is, my fellow Christian, my fellow man. That is, I'm looking out for the needs of that individual. Is it possible that I can take that which belongs to another and follow the golden rule? No. I'm taking that which belongs to another person. Number 4, gambling is addictive. Gambling is an addiction. So now, right here, I want to stop for a moment and think about addictive behavior. According to John chapter 8, verse 34, our Lord said, everyone that commits sin is a bondservant of sin. He's a slave of sin. All right, committing sin is in the present tense. It means if you continue to commit sin, you become a slave to sin. Sin enslaves us. And that's what gambling does. It enslaves individuals. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 12, there's an instructive text here by Paul when he's discussing some things that are not related necessarily to gambling, but to eating of meats and also fornication. And I want you to hear what he has to say. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12. So instructive, so enlightening. He said, all things are lawful for me. What he means by that is all foods. Every kind of food is lawful for me to eat. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are expedient, that is best. All things are lawful, but I will not be brought under the power of any. That is to say, I'm not going to be controlled by anything. Now that would apply to gluttony, it would apply to drinking, it would apply to many things, but I'm not going to be controlled by anything. Gambling is an addiction. There's so many people today seeing therapists because of the addiction to gambling. So think about this particular study. This is from the University of Maryland. This was conducted last year, and what gambling does to individuals. Think about this. These are the risks they say are involved in gambling. Number 1, they tell us that problem gambling, which they say is only 1% of the population, that is, people who are in problem gambling. Problem gambling is on the rise. 20% of the population are on the edge. But that's not where the story stops. Number 2, 90% of problem gamblers use credit cards. 90% use credit cards. 23 million Americans go into debt due to gambling. Let's just stop here for a moment. I want you to think about the concept that what we have going on in a socialistic type of society where the government takes from some and gives to the other, 23 million Americans are in debt. They're in serious financial trouble. But who's rescuing them? Not you by voluntary motion, but the government takes from you and gives to another so that they can do what? Gamble. Gamble. That's what's going on. That's what's happening. 20% of all bankruptcies are linked to gambling. 20% of all bankruptcies are linked to gambling. How about this one? 1 in 6 addictive gamblers attempt suicide. 1 in 6 attempt suicide. The next, 1 in 10 college students have gambling addictions. The study at the University of Maryland says on the college campuses, this is absolutely on the meteoric rise. That is gambling. So 1 in 10 have gambling addictions. That is frightening. And then the next one is problem gamblers are 2 times more likely to divorce because, of course, of the problems it creates in the home. Consider this also. Many people, they say, spend more money than intended on gambling. Many people get into serious financial trouble because of gambling. And here's something else. Think about how many people lie to cover their gambling habits and gambling practices. One thing leads to another, and many people lie to cover what they have lost. I've seen some of that in the extended family as well, that people lie because they have lost so much money gambling. People are unable to set limits. What is that? It's just lack of self-control, lack of soberness. Or we have problems paying bills or gambling to cover losses. They have so much loss, they gamble again and becomes addiction, so it becomes a self-revolving cycle on the way down. Borrowing money from friends and family and then experiencing poor job performance. Gambling is an addiction. And Paul tells us very plainly, I should not be brought under the power of any. And he's even talking about things that are right and good, such as food. Don't be brought and controlled under the power of anything. But that's what gambling does. It takes people in that direction. I mentioned earlier the cross of Christ. Our Lord had a tunic. We're told in John chapter 19, verse 26 and following. He had a tunic that was woven from the top throughout, no seam within it. The soldiers did not want to rip it, so they had 4 soldiers, a quaternion of soldiers, that crucified our Lord. And what did they do? They gambled for his clothes. I want you to think about, for just a moment, the difference that we have here. Christ on the cross, Mary Magdalene, Mary his mother, John the disciple, standing at the cross of our Lord. And on the other scene, right over here, the soldiers gambling for his clothes. Just as Isaiah said in 65 and verse 11, people forget the house of the Lord when they begin to set a table for fortune and mix a drink to destiny. And the distinction is very clear at the cross of Christ. So which side are we going to be on? We don't want to be with the gamblers of the soldiers. Perhaps, and most likely, did not see anything wrong with it, but it does violate the very principles of the Bible. The lesson is yours. If you want to respond to the invitation, now's the time to come to the front. We will assist you in your obedience to the gospel, repenting of sin, or whatever it may be. If you come right now while we stand and sing,